Today we're going to be talking about the entire run of the Immortal Iron Fist. We've got the good, we've got the bad, and whatever it is that Foreman was doing. Woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written initially by Matt Fraction and Ed Brubaker, then later taken over by Duane and primarily illustrated by David Aja and Foreman, the first issue of the Immortal Iron Fist was published by Marvel Comics in November of 2006, with the 27th and final issue being released in June of 2009. And Danny Rand has a lot of work to do. Between keeping Rand Enterprises afloat and defending New York as Iron Fist, the last thing that he needs is to be forced into a tournament against the Immortal Weapons. But what happens when the lineage of the Iron Fist is disputed? And how does the Hydra takeover threaten to derail everything that Danny cherishes? This review may seem ironic because the best way to summarise this run, both the art and the story, is through the yin and yang. For everything that's great, there's something that's equally as disappointing, and it should come as no surprise that the greatness in the art throughout the Immortal Iron Fist is because of David Aja. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Personally, I think his work here is even better than the stuff that he did on Hawkeye. From the first issue with the rooftop fight in the rain, I just knew that this was going to be something special. And pretty much every technique that I give credit to in other reviews, he manages to incorporate. The motion is fluid and clear to see, he balances light and dark flawlessly, the perspective mixes it up and keeps it interesting, and just look at the rain. Admittedly, it can't all be like that, and the same level of finesse isn't there when it's more Danny than Iron Fist. There are still some fun techniques that are used, like the use of onomatopoeia and variety of paneling that keeps it interesting, but it really is about the action when it comes to David Aja. And one thing I don't remember seeing a lot of across Marvel titles during this time is just that gritty style that David Aja brings. Sure, there were other artists like Michael Locke that were a bit similar, but having Aja on this title gave it that serious tone that it needed. And a nice little touch of his that really reminded me of Joel Jones during Lady Killer and Andrea Sorrentino during Green Arrow was just his ability to highlight a very subtle moment. It's especially impressive during the action because it does it without ever breaking the pace. And it just added to that sense of mastery that Danny had towards his fighting style. It made it feel like it was a more intelligent battle rather than it just being a brawl. And one little thing that I noticed with Aja is that when he drew Danny in a shirt and tie, it really looked like Hellblazer. Early on there's some really nice flashback scenes that do have a different look from the rest of the series, so it does make it feel separate from Danny's story, but unfortunately I just didn't enjoy these moments as much. And that may also have something to do with the story aspect of it, but I'll probably touch on that later. But it was a lot cleaner and the line work was more concise, and some of these flashback scenes were done by Foreman, and admittedly he is my biggest problem with the art. Not so much during the flashbacks, but I do think that maybe I was just giving him a free pass, but everything about his art felt like it was made by that program that reads everything on a topic and then just generates what it thinks the story should be. There's a semblance of regular art there, but there's just something that feels really artificial about it, and it's just always a bit off. And trust me, it gets worse the longer that the run goes on. Even during Lemire's Animal Man run, which is a series that I love, I found his art to be the biggest hurdle into getting into that first arc. And I try hard to avoid being harsh on art because it is a personal style and there is a passion that's gone into developing it. But I think that's where my problem with Foreman lies. It feels rushed and with little care and just straight up like there was no effort put into it. And even now I'm wondering if I'm being too mean, but I'm gonna have to do something that I've never done before during one of my reviews, but let me show you the evidence. This page, this single page in issue 26 encapsulates everything that pissed me off about his style. Firstly, can you gather where this scene is located? Maybe you can't guess, and don't feel bad about it, because why could you? There are absolutely zero backgrounds on this page, and instead there's just some shitty generic gradient that even my dumbass could have created with about 2 seconds. And yeah, I know that probably is a colorist, but I can't imagine this is some kind of Jack Kirby deal where the colorist went in and rubbed out the backgrounds. All of the figures on this page never look right, whether we're in a wide shot or a close-up. This woman here is described as being irresistibly sexy, but even a guy as desperate as me thinks that she's got a body that looks like a bottle of Prime. And I mean the UK version. Fat Cobra, and yes, that is his real name, don't come at me for body shaming. I can't even tell what he's supposed to be doing here. Has he fallen over? Is he delivering a kick? Is he just standing still and Foreman wanted to give us some upskirting angle? And the thing that bugged me constantly, why can't this guy draw a neck? Has he just never seen one? Did he grow up in a tribe of giraffes and thought that's just what everyone looked like? Like, why is Danny's neck both wider and larger than his head? And that's including his hair. How does this guy even turn his head or fold washing? He looks like he's made from the Michael Keaton Batman costume. At least it's not just Danny, because Fat Cobra seems to suffer from the same affliction, which gives me the feeling that the Fat Cobra in his name is in reference to that girthy neck of his. Like, I could probably do an entire video just going in on how awful this page is. It's probably the worst single page of art that I've seen in a good number of years. Oh, hold on, I'm getting a call. Yeah, okay. It's The Dark Knight Strikes Again. It wants its art back. To give it credit, there are some occasional moments of decent art in the second half of the series, but they are few and far between and they just never reach the same heights as David Aja. And it angers me when I'm talking about the problems with this art because it started with such a strong style. But all of those problems that are highlighted on that one page happen frequently whilst Foreman's illustrating it. At one point he just uses arrows to tell you what you should be looking at, and it doesn't feel like a stylistic choice, it just feels lazy. And it's a book I definitely recommend checking out for yourself to see if you have the same experience. And you know what, why not get it for a little bit cheaper with the discount codes that we've got with the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below and you can use these codes as many times as you like. Before we jump into the story review, just know that if you love this run, I'm going to be talking about the bad aspects of it. And if you hate this series, I'm going to be giving it some praise. That's because it's impossible to just focus on one when reviewing the Immortal Iron Fist. Again, it's with the yin and the yang, and I think it's very easy to forget who Iron Fist was before this run came out. Reading it today, it's easy to appreciate the story that Fraction and Brubaker gave us, but the reason why this is so revered is because it made Iron Fist a character that you had to pay attention to, which is why it's so annoying that it just dove off a cliff after they left. But the best part is that Matt and Ed managed to do that without doing a complete 180 on who Iron Fist is. If anything, Fraction and Brubaker leaned into that and gave us a story centered around the mythology of the Iron Fist, and gave us a history of the lineage and Kun Lun. And when I first jumped into this series many years ago because I was such a massive fan of Daredevil, I was way too young to consider all that. But coming back to it now, it's interesting to see how it managed to balance all of that without it ever clogging up the pace. Speaking of which, and I feel like I'm saying this a lot in my recent reviews, but the pace in this first arc was exactly what this run needed. It also felt like the opening arc was the best balance between New York and Kun Lun. There was also exciting boardroom scenes, and it was one of the best examples of organised chaos. There was a lot going on in this first storyline, even Hydra was thrown into the mix, but it never felt like it was too much or they were just hoping to see what would stick. Additionally, I was a big fan of how this touched on the wider Marvel universe, but it didn't let the story get bogged down by it. To me, that is the perfect combination, especially when you've got two creators that were so involved in other titles. And since the re-release of the Omnibus was announced, I've heard people say that you need to read Civil War and you need to read Brubaker's Daredevil to understand what's going on in here. And for me, I don't think it's the case. If you do know what happens in those stories, I feel like it does enhance it, but it's not integral. And all I'd recommend is knowing the basics of what happened during Civil War. Although at the risk of sounding like a hypocrite, I do wish there would have been more tension between Luke and Danny as a result of Civil War. Like when the story starts out, they're not together as a part of Heroes for Hire, but it's clear that there's not really any real beef between them. Whenever Danny's in a bit of trouble, Luke still comes running. Also, I liked how Danny, Wendell and Orson being white was actually part of the narrative, rather than shying away from it or tiptoeing around it. Whereas Brubaker and Fraction made it a part of the storyline, especially in those flashback scenes when Wendell was seen as an outsider. And there was also great stuff with Orson where people were doubting him. It's almost as if from the beginning that Brubaker and Fraction said that they were going to take every single excuse that somebody could have to not read an Iron Fist book, but turn it on its head and make it as a reason to read it. Orson himself was a great character, and those flashback scenes during the war were probably some of my favourites. And I love the comparisons that you were led to draw between him and Danny. It almost felt like a spin on the "it's a twisted version of yourself from the future" type of story, but they gave us a new character that kept me guessing. Also, his fighting style was phenomenal, especially when you saw him working alongside Danny, and I swear this was the origin of Gun Fu, like John Wick must have taken notes. What's also great is that the second arc felt like a natural progression of the story, but at the same time it went in a completely different direction. Yeah, I know that sounds contradictory. The tournament between the Immortal Weapons was really entertaining, and I wish it would have had more importance over the overall storyline. Because of the scenes that we'd already had with Davos, just the concept of this reminded me of the Karate Kid, and I was all for it. But it was at this point that the wider plot began to take over, and unfortunately this got a little bit overshadowed. Because the espionage storyline about the takeover of Rand Enterprises was fun, especially in the beginning, but I can't say that it was the most interesting part. The Hogarth storyline where he's being held hostage so that some trains could be built was one that I really failed to engage with, and it felt like they included it so that they could give Luke and Misty a storyline to get involved with whilst Danny was off doing the tournament, especially so once that competition had started. It felt like this was just an element of the previous arc that they didn't know how they could get rid of it. I was really really excited to see the rest of Davos's plan come to fruition, but unfortunately that lost a lot of steam once the rest of the Immortal Weapons were introduced. As a result, the second storyline felt massively rushed, or maybe worse, abandoned, as we ran up to the war for Kun Lun, which I got the feeling was meant to be a much bigger moment than it panned out to be. I almost got whiplash with how quickly this battle happened, and the development of the camaraderie between the Immortal Weapons didn't feel organic either. One moment they were willing to die fighting each other, and then the next they were having dinner together and willing to die for each other, and it just didn't click as well as I feel like it could have done. But looking at this sort of conclusion now, I can't help but wonder why Fraction and Brubaker left so suddenly and decided to cram so much story into just a couple of issues. I've read interviews with the duo after their departure was already announced, and it seems like it was amicable and that they were happy with it, so reading the full run now, it just feels a bit odd and something really doesn't add up. What's worse is that some storylines just didn't get a conclusion. There was one really interesting plot about this ancient enemy of the Iron Fist lineage and about how all Iron Fists seem to die at the same age, but it just kind of went nowhere. And it was one of those storylines that was started during the Fraction issues but continued into the second half, so I'm not sure if maybe Duane just didn't want to follow through with it, because there was still a brief mention of that character in the final issue, but I'm not sure if this was a series that was cancelled or it was ended on its own terms. But in the grand scheme of things, I think it really could have benefited from taking out some of those history lesson issues and just pad this story out a bit more, or at least just, you know, finish it off properly. Davos, the Steel Serpent, who I've already mentioned, had a plotline that just fell flat towards the end, whereas he was a real highlight early on in this book. So call me a conspiracy theorist all you want, but I feel like what we saw in issue 16 wasn't where Fraction and Brubaker wanted to end this story. Maybe we should do some kind of new Twitter movement, hashtag release the Fraction cut. And up until now, I've mostly avoided speaking about the story after they departed, but unfortunately it is unavoidable, unless you've got the first printing of this omnibus and then you're fine. And even when I try to consider other people's perspectives and what people want out of a story, I can't really see a lot of people enjoying the second half of this book more than the first, or even really enjoying it overall. Because going straight out to what Fraction and Brubaker wrote, I can't even say that it's enjoyable. The worst part is it just feels like that let me copy your homework meme. But the thing it changes is the level of enjoyment. It treads a lot of the same steps from the first half of the book, but it takes out the pace, the exciting fights, the character development, and gives us that art. It's okay. The art section's done, it can't hurt you now. The majority of Swierczynski's time on this title, and I believe I'm pronouncing his name correctly, there's no disrespect intended if I've got it wrong, sees Danny venture into this mystical city that most people didn't even think existed. And then he kind of just gets held captive for 5 issues. I was so bored during this part of the story and there was nothing that pulled me back in. I even stopped caring about Danny even though he is in this dire situation because the most interesting plotline surrounding him just kind of disappeared. And what's worse is that this run did a really great job of making him a likeable character. It gave him a good sense of humour with his sarcasm, but at the same time it was never too grating. And I did like him and I wanted to see him do well, but as soon as Fraction and Brubaker left I just didn't care as much. The progress made between Danny and Misty also came to a complete stop, which made it feel like the why behind Danny's actions wasn't there anymore, and it made the majority of everything after issue 20 just feel like filler. And you'll notice I said issue 20 and not 16, because Duane did get off to a good start with his first few issues. And I didn't like it as much as the Brubaker and Fraction stuff, but I didn't hate it either, even if it was mostly just issue after issue of Danny getting his ass handed to him. But the Immortal Weapons were also just kind of there after the war for Kun Lun. And worse, they all just kind of blended into one character. Sure, one was fat and one was attractive and one dealt with spiders, but it never felt like they were really individuals. And they mostly just followed Danny around. And the worst part of it all, there was just way too many flashbacks. During the first half of the story when they'd crop up, they felt interesting and engaged with the main plot of the story. There was some kind of lesson there that Danny could learn, or it'd be an entire issue that you'd read between story arcs, so it never felt like it was breaking up the pace. But towards the end, it's just a random mess. It felt like there must have been some kind of quota for flashbacks that just had to be filled, regardless of how important or even entertaining they were. And it really must have been a headache reading this in single issues, because at the end of issue 20 there's a massive cliffhanger where the characters discover something that's been teased for a good chunk of this run. It says that it's to be concluded, you'd assume it's in the next issue, but then issue 21 is just a standalone story about some futuristic Kid Iron Fist. Like there's a time and a place to be doing that shit. Without spoiling anything, it ends with a bit of a whimper as well. Again, I'm not sure if this was cancelled and they just had to wrap things up quickly, but I can't imagine anybody finding this to be a satisfying ending, and it's why I'd recommend probably just stop reading this after Fraction and Brubaker left. And if I'm being honest, I was pretty much on autopilot once Danny and the rest of the Immortal Weapons were stuck in hell, if that's what we're gonna call it. Sure, the baffling art didn't help me to engage either, but when I do bag on a title, kinda like when I reviewed Outcast, which is another series that derailed itself pretty much at the same point, I don't enjoy being that negative. Sure, I'm a nitpicker, it's something that I can't help but avoid, but I do also like trying to find all the positives. So I've touched on my major criticisms with the second half of the book, but in all honesty, there is not much that I enjoyed about the last 6 issues of this title. But to end this part of the review with some positivity, the early fights were a massive highlight for me in the Immortal Iron Fist. Each time Danny would go up against the Steel Serpent or Hydra, it was so tense because there was always something else going on beyond just the fight. And that theme did also continue when they went into the tournament, which is why I wish we could have spent a bit more time there. But for a character that is centered around martial arts, I love that it felt like these fights were included for a reason other than the fact that Danny's just really good at fighting, even if they did still manage to find a way to incorporate the business side of his life without it ever feeling like it wasn't a welcome part. This is my final verdict. And it's unfortunate that this run of the Immortal Iron Fist felt like the epitome of 1 step forward but 2 steps back. When Fraction and Brubaker kicked off this series, it was a breath of fresh air that Danny Rand desperately needed. They respected the lore of Kun Lun but found new and exciting ways to expand the mythos. The character of Iron Fist was finally getting the reinvention that he deserved, and there wasn't much that went wrong in the first half of this book besides the rushed ending of some of its story arcs. And in many ways, the original printing of the Omnibus that excludes everything after Matt and Ed had already left the title might actually be the optimal version of this run, because once Swierczynski takes over, and yeah, I'm still not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, this title loses nearly everything that made it interesting in the first place. The art feels soulless and has no charm. The story just treads the same steps that came before it but with less passion, and I honestly don't know why they continued with this series. And with how divisive the world is, I'm sure that there are going to be people who love this whole thing from start to finish, but if I'm going to give an honest review and not just say what I think people want to hear, there is not much that I can recommend about the second half of this series. And when I review titles like this where that yin and yang divide couldn't be more obvious, I try to balance the good with the bad and look at it more as a whole, but when there's such a clear jumping off point, it becomes a bit more tricky. Do I think about my overall enjoyment, or do I think about my overall disappointment in that drop in quality? Because if it ended at issue 16 with a more wrapped up conclusion, I would have been sitting here now probably giving it about an 80%. If it would have just been the second half, it would be a maximum of 30, and that's if I got through it in the first place. So for the full 27 issue run, and when I think about it as a complete package, I feel comfortable giving it 50%. Woof! So that's the video, and hopefully you enjoyed it, but until next time, just make sure that you stay safe and stay mad, all you dogs. Woof woof! See you at the next video.